what do these three words mean? I'll give you guys a pass on the first one.
Oh, no, wait. It has to do with the river and lake, but I forget. Spokane.
Yeah.
Right?
Sustainer life. And how about the second two words? So these three words, I actually went online to find this out. I found out what the indigenous territory of the land is. So this land is the traditional territory of the Spokane, Pandore, and the Tanaksa First Peoples. And you know, we've had a bunch of moments in this entire conference where we've kind of acknowledged that we are on land that is not ours. There were native peoples that have been here for thousands and thousands of years before, you know, settlers came in and took over this land. And, you know, I kind of have a question to everyone here. We acknowledge it, but why is it important to acknowledge this?
Well, there's still people of the tribes that are here.
Yeah.
There's meaning to the land that we should respect.
Maybe taking responsibility for what people in the past have done.
Absolutely. So a couple of things. Really, so who here has heard of the word reconciliation before? So reconciliation, it's often something that we talk about when we're talking about addressing historical injustices. And this is one of those things. You know, reconciliation starts with gestures, but then it moves into movements where we're really going out and changing the way that things really function in our communities. So by acknowledging really the land that we're on, that's our first step in really righting the wrongs of the past in these relationships that we've had with indigenous peoples of our land. Now, I'll start off. My name is Abhay. My full name is Abhayjeet Singh Sachal. You guys can call me Abhay, no worries. And that's me 2 years ago. In 2016, I had the chance to go up to the Arctic. Now, the Arctic is such a beautiful place, but I'm kind of going to move back a couple steps before I really start talking about that. I was born in India, but when I was 11 months old, I moved to Vancouver. So in a suburb of Vancouver, in a city called Surrey. Now, living in this place, I got such beautiful exposure to the ocean on one side, mountains on the other, and forests all around me. It was such a beautiful place that I lived in, and I continue to really appreciate that to this day. And living in this beautiful place, it really taught me the value of how important nature is in our daily lives. Because for me, it allowed me to have something to really connect with on a daily basis, understand what it means to be environmental stewards from a personal standpoint. So growing up, I had this connection with nature that I really wanted to pursue. And then going into the beginning of high school, I joined my environmental club and little things like that that really got me connected again with different issues. So in 2016, I got the amazing opportunity to travel up to the Arctic. And if you can see, so that's Eastern Canada. We sailed out of the capital of one of the territories in Canada, down that bay, down the coastal Labrador, and all the way up to Greenland. So this was a 2-week-long expedition from the Students on Ice Foundation. Now, Students on Ice, this is something that if you're an educator, you should especially know, because they give scholarships to students to travel to the Arctic every single year. So they do expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic. And by going on this expedition, it was such an amazing experience. So I got a full $12,000 scholarship from the United States Embassy to take part in this expedition. And that was really interesting to note because, you know, the fact that the United States Embassy to Canada was sponsoring me for this expedition was incredible. So going up to the Arctic, I saw extraordinary things. I was on this expedition for 2 weeks long with 120 different students from around the world. So students from different walks of life, different cultures, different experiences. And apart from that, I was with 100 educators. So these were scientists, historians, and I did amazing things in the Arctic. One thing was, well, swimming in the Arctic Ocean. You know, I showed my mom this picture and she called me crazy. That's what moms do. But we also went kayaking near these giant glaciers. And there were these extraordinary moments where we saw this beautiful wildlife. And just seeing all of this firsthand, it really got me aware of the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. So often climate change is talked about as an issue of the future. And at this conference, a major theme has been centralizing the conversation around how climate change is impacting real people today. Impacting real people today. It's such a powerful thing because climate change, again, it's human-caused actions that are changing the environment in such a sense that it's having profound impacts on real people living around the world today. So by going up to the Arctic, I saw, there was this one day, it was actually the first day that we were on this ship, full of us 200 people from different walks of life, and we saw 9 polar bears. 9 polar bears. So this was actually a shot that one of my friends got of the polar bears up close. And one thing that I noticed was, although the conversation about climate change kind of started off being a lot bigger with the symbol of the polar bear, with Coca-Cola advertisements, one thing I realized was polar bears are kind of doing okay. Polar bears aren't really the ones that are the most impacted by climate change because Inuit elders who are living in the Arctic are noting that polar bears are moving further south every single year. So they're moving to where they're adapting really to the climate, and they have that opportunity to adapt. This is one moment that I will never forget. This is the Ilulissat Ice Fjord in Greenland. It's an absolutely breathtaking place. And while looking at this, it was us 200 educators, different people, and we all went silent for a moment. We all went silent, and we could literally hear the ice melting. Think about that for a minute. Millions of drops of water going into the freshest, the purest place on Earth. And I heard that. I heard that inundating feeling of kind of feeling hopeless at that moment. I mean, if the ice was melting at that rate, what could we do? What was possible? And I really had no idea of what, the implications were, what this meant for other people. And I learned from the people that were on this expedition with me that climate change is having very significant impacts on the communities themselves. So in the Arctic, there's this omnipresent layer of ice on the surface called permafrost. And because of climate change, this permafrost is melting unevenly. So that means pipes beneath the surface are actually breaking. So we're talking about small communities of maybe thousands of people living in these rural, remote places. And it's costing millions and millions of dollars to fix these problems. And it's not really feasible for a government because they don't have that political incentive to do anything again. So we're finding this intersectionality between these different issues. And more than that, there's issues in housing, water security, food insecurity, and learning all of this from personal perspectives, from friends, from everyone that was around me. It was, amazing. So I saw amazing wildlife. This was one of the most powerful moments at the Ilulissat Ice Fjord, where we all gathered and had this learning experience from a really personal perspective. And going to this place, so those are little zodiacs that we were on, and we went all the way that close to glaciers, and then the glaciers started calving. So at that point, we just raced away, because, And again, really going up to the Arctic, seeing all of this firsthand, it got me to really think of how interconnected all these different systems are, whether it's the climate, whether it's looking at how people live their daily lives. So one really important factor that really struck me was how the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the native people that have been living there since time immemorial, so they're known as the Inuit. The Inuit have very specific hunting, very specific land practices to make the best sustainable use of the land. And it's how they've really adapted to changes. But as of the past 30 years, climate change has happened at such a significant rate that Inuit peoples have had to change their lives completely. And now it's having profound impacts on health. And now one thing that I really learned was Inuit suicide rates are 11 times the Canadian national average. 11 times the Canadian national average. It's an insane statistic. And, I went back to Ottawa, capital of Canada, to talk to people about this experience, in front of an audience there, all inspired, but also questioning what I could do. I was very, nervous, and I had no idea what I could do. And really, the day I got back from my expedition, I slept for what felt like 2 weeks. Because you guys know what that's like. Going on a long trip, you come back home and you're really tired and you sleep for as long as possible. But I remember waking up, texting one of my best friends who lives in Baker Lake in Nunavut. And I texted her, and she told me that when she was gone to the Arctic, her community was completely broken. She told me that when she was gone on what was supposed to be an extraordinary trip of a lifetime, back home her boyfriend took a gun to his head, and he pulled the trigger. It was a moment when I realized all of this, it's not just up in the air anymore. It hit home because it was real. It was real, the idea that because Inuit suicide rates are 11 times the national average, my own friend was impacted by this. Her own grandparents and her parents were affected by mental health issues, and it was really profound in her community. And learning about this from a personal perspective, I realized that it was that personal connection that made me care about it so much. Because, we hear about things like this in the news all the time, whether it's hurricanes on the other side of the planet, or hurricanes in the States, or, flooding on the other side of the planet. But it doesn't give you that initial connection because, again, it's just another natural disaster because there's so many happening. But by getting personally connected to this issue, that's when I realized the power of personal connection. And it's a power that every single person has. It's that ability to make a profound impact in someone else's life by simply talking to them. And it was that friendship with my friend Andrea that really made me so empathetic towards her situation. And looking at the vast scale of things, I came back home and I decided, what if there was a way for us living down in southern Canada to talk to kids living up in the Arctic, to learn, firsthand what the impacts of climate change are on those communities. One last statistic that I can give you guys to kind of back up the idea of this trauma that's felt because of climate change. Because Inuit suicide rates are 11 times the national average, there's a lot of programs in place to try to lower this statistic. But if we look at why, a large portion of this, increased suicide rate has been attributed towards climate change. And, you may think, how can a change in climate impact, suicide rates? But there's this concept called solastalgia. So solastalgia is kind of the opposite of nostalgia. So nostalgia is when you kind of have memories of being somewhere. But solastalgia is when you're physically in a location, but you feel like it's not your home anymore. Because Indigenous peoples, specifically the Inuit, have had such a strong dependence on their land and such a strong connection, because they see the land as a part of themselves, not as something separate, not something to be owned, but as a part of their own being. Because they have such a strong connection, the fact that this connection has been severed, it has had impacts on mental health. And it's a large portion of why suicide rates. And a study was actually done in New Zealand showing that average farmers, because of a changing climate, when weather patterns were different, suicide rates actually went up in these communities. So by linking these statistics, there's so many ways that are showing that climate change is not just, not just the impact of hurricanes that we see now. It's also going to have vast implications for health in the future. So coming back home, I wanted to do something about this. So with my brother, Sakmi, that's him. Yeah, we're both pretty cool. No pun intended. But he actually had the chance to go up to the Arctic in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. So that's northwestern Canada. And he was up there for 6 months. Living in Inuvik. He was teaching biology and chemistry to students over there. And that's him at the Arctic Ocean, frozen behind him, of course taking that shirt off. And if you want to know something about my brother, he's a bit of a poser. But really, by going to the Arctic, my brother he created connections with these youth that were at his school. So these were normal youth, but a lot were Indigenous. So they had several issues because of whether it's a history of trauma in Canada against Indigenous peoples, or things like climate change and the impacts that it's having now. By talking to the students and creating personal connections with them, he actually helped establish a program. So this program was initially called Break the Divide. Break the Divide, it was this idea that maybe if we get youth living in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, talking to kids in my hometown of Delta, British Columbia, so in southern Canada, maybe if we get these kids Skyping each other, becoming electronic pen pals, just maybe they'll have a bit of a change in their actions. Maybe they'll learn something, maybe they'll be able to kind of connect on a different basis. And that's what we did. So, they're really far away from each other, and looking now, maybe Spokane's down here somewhere, and talking to these students about the impacts of climate change. So essentially the way that the program started was we had youth video calling one another, learning firsthand what it's like to live in this different place, what their lifestyles are like, how do you live on a daily basis? Finding commonalities like how kids would watch Netflix for hours, regardless of where they lived, or how they loved music or sports. So by getting those buddies, they created those connections, those friendships that are so essential. And then based on that, they talked about issues in their communities. So whether it's drugs and gang violence, or whether it's climate change, we talked about very real issues impacting these communities themselves. And based on talking about those issues, the youth were able to kind of start brainstorming solutions for one another. So at the Siakwam chapter of Break the Divide, so Siakwam is my high school. At this chapter, we managed to organize a couple of events to kind of break the divide in the community itself, to kind of connect people with one another, to work on these community action projects. So that guy in the back, he's not on his tippy toes. He's 7'2". He's actually someone who was drafted into the NBA, and we had the chance to bring him out to my high school, Siakwam, and by bringing him out to the school, he played with the kids, he did a little basketball game, we raised some money, and he talked about his journey, coming from a rural income family, a rural village in India, and going to the NBA and becoming an all-star really. We started a program with students with disabilities at the school, students with special needs, to kind of work with them on, just making them feel a part of the community and working with them. We started giving presentations to elementary school students in Surrey at the different chapters. We organized a mental health night to kind of break the stigmas behind mental health. And I had the chance to speak at different stages about this kind of network that was developing. And really, what Break the Divide has become, it's instead of just being that initial connection between that school in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories and Delta, British Columbia, we've kind of realized the potential of personal connection, not only for climate change, but for a lot of different issues, for youth in general. So I actually had the chance to go to Vimy Ridge in France, and I made a couple of connections for Break the Divide there. So that's Prince William in the picture there. That's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. Pretty cool people. But overall, just being able to engage in video calls with people from different walks of life. I had the chance to go to India, talk to a school there, and we're actually working on setting up a school over there so that youth can interact with one another. Talk about how can we create change based on the issues facing your community. And last March in 2017, I was a presenter at the CLEAF conference, so the League of Environmental Educators in Florida.
That's me.
That's Chris right there. It's awesome seeing him here again. But being able to go to these different places, we're starting Break the Divide chapters, and it's becoming a bit of an international network. So apart from those connections between the Canadian Arctic and these different locations, we recently set up a chapter in Cape Town, South Africa. So I have a quick question here. Does anyone know a little bit about Cape Town? Anything at all?
It's in Africa.
Cape Town is in South Africa, yes.
It's a Dutch colony.
Dutch colony?
Issues of water.
Yeah, water issues.
Fresh water.
Fresh water issues. And this was something, it's really amazing how this connection happened. I heard about a bit of a drought going on in Cape Town. I found out through the news that there was a drought that had been going on for about 2 or 3 years now. The city of Cape Town hasn't gotten much water. And that really interested me. And then, as if it was destiny, someone from Cape Town actually reached out to me and said that they wanted to start a chapter of Break the Divide at their school in Cape Town. That's why I got some water. But by talking to youth in Cape Town, South Africa, about this water crisis that's going on in the community now, they're actually limited to using only 50 liters of water a day. And that translates to roughly 12 gallons of water a day. Now, to put things into perspective, the average Canadian and American uses 350 liters of water a day, or close to 90 gallons. So maybe a 10-fold increase. Yet, Cape Town is a very developed city in South Africa. You know, it's very similar to Vancouver, actually. They have the ocean on one side, mountains on the other, and it was so interesting to hear how similar their lives are to us. Yet, at the same time, because of this water crisis, it's actually youth and the most impoverished communities that are facing the effects. Because the government isn't going after the richest people in the town who are, you know, wasting the most water. Instead, they're going to people who rely on car washes to make a living. They're going to, you know, places where people don't have enough access to clean water already, and they're limiting their water usage. And this is something that really isn't covered in the news. It's not something we hear about on a daily basis. So by connecting with these youth, youth in Cape Town actually went to these local townships, some of the rural areas of Cape Town, and started making videos with the youth there to kind of talk about what can we do. And currently we're working on making a water project. So really we're creating a challenge to release throughout the world to limit your water usage to 10 gallons of water a day, kind of see what it's like, use the little tricks that they have, and understand that by doing so, you're breaking the divide between these different communities. So overall, I've really found that the implications of Break the Divide, using a modern form of technology to interact with one another in a social setting, creating friendships, and then creating change based on that, to break down the socioeconomic, racial, geographical barriers between communities. That starts with conversation. So that's where personalized environmental education comes in. This was the experience in the Arctic, where I faced that initial personal environmental education. And now, by connecting it with different people in the world, by connecting it, the vision really is to have this intersectionality with health, with infrastructural issues, so that people can understand how climate change is having impacts now on communities around the world. And it's a lot about youth leadership, the idea that youth have the power to create this change in their communities. They have the chance to really go out, kind of understand what can they do, understand the solutions in a holistic approach, and work together to solve some of the biggest problems that we as a society face. You know, in regards to youth leadership, it really comes down to those initial conversations. And this isn't just about youth anymore. It's about every single person here. Because from the keynote yesterday, one of the biggest things that I took away was this idea that you don't need to know a lot about climate change to change someone's mind. But if you're someone's friend, if you're someone's family member, you have that chance to talk about a real world impact of the climate on someone else's life. Whether that person is in the Arctic, or whether that's someone in your own community that you know, whether it's the farming industry that you know is going to be impacted by changes in weather patterns, changes, you know, sea level rise, all these issues. Because again, psychologically speaking, it is very difficult for humans to connect with a message of fear for 20 years in the future, or 40 years in the future, right? Because, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 40 years. But I know that when we do have these conversations about the real world implications now, that's how we're going to go out and understand what we can do. So youth leadership has really been profound in terms of how we've gotten to talk about these different issues. One program that I can really speak to that got me involved in the environmental movement is Young Reporters for the Environment. So Young Reporters for the Environment is a UN-sponsored competition that works on making youth, journalists themselves, So I'm actually here with 3 other students from my high school, Megan, Abeera, and Kisa. And I also want to give a huge shout out at this time to Mr. Ted Johnson. Ted Johnson. Ted is the learning director in the Delta School District. So he's basically a district principal, and he's taken time out to drive us out here from Vancouver. So it was a fun 7-hour drive. Got to learn about some rock music, got cultured in that. We kind of showed him some of our music. So it was a good experience. What was the thing?
Led Zeppelin?
Led Zeppelin, yes. I love it now. And by really connecting on a basis of young reporters from the environment, though, this is a program that allowed me to learn firsthand what it's like to be an international journalist. And now us 4 youth here, we're acting as young reporters for the environment in this competition to really report on these issues as youth and then brainstorm our own solutions. So they have 310,000 young reporters in 34 countries around the world. So again, this is an incredible program that has empowered me to become a bit of a leader myself. Another organization is Be the Change at the Line. So we actually have the founding director of Be the Change at the Lines, Maureen, over here in the audience. Yes. Be the Change at the Lines really has a lot of ways to engage youth. So one way that they do this is through an interactive program. They have climate-specific lessons on sustainability that they give to teachers throughout British Columbia, so throughout the province. And they give this to teachers so that we can have engaging environmental lessons. Because I know that in 8th grade, in high school, when I had the chance to learn about climate change in ways that it impacted me, from my own a social studies teacher who's actually on the board of directors of Be the Change at the Lines. By having those lessons, that got me so engaged. And it shows, it just goes to show how that little basis of connection in environmentalism that really can empower youth to be leaders. So Be the Change at the Lines also has a climate action portal where they empower young people by giving them training and support on how to be leaders and lead climate action projects. And lastly, again, the Delta School District was has always been such a great supporter of my own work, of other youth in our school district, and of Break the Divide as a whole. Thank you so much to the Delta School District for bringing us out here. Thank you, Ted, again. It means a lot just to have people in the education system that are willing to support youth, that really want us to do our best so that not only are we leaders of tomorrow, but we're able to lead today. And I think that's so important because, again, the conversation needs to turn from climate change happening tomorrow, climate change happening today, to us changing the entire system today. What can we do about that? How can we impact different people through our actions? And really, what can we do to expand our networks to create more of a significant impact? So again, Break the Divide, it's all about connection. Pop quiz. Who has any idea what this logo means? Not anyone who knows, though. Take a wild guess, someone.
Morse code?
It is Morse code. Wow, no one usually gets that. So it's dash, dot, 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 dash, dash. So the 2 dashes are just connected for aesthetics. And then dot, dot. So it says BTD and Morse code. And really it symbolizes connecting the dots, connecting communities. It's really how together we're going to change environmental education. And truly I do believe that with all of our work here, we can break the divide. Thank you. One last quick announcement. This Saturday, we actually have a session, a Bright Spot session. Is it at 8:30 a.m.?
Yeah.
At 8:30 a.m., 2 young leaders, so they're also seniors in high school like me, Abeera and Kisa are giving a presentation on some of the work that we've done in the Delta School District. So if you guys are free then, you should definitely check that out. So it's a Bright Spot at 8:30 a.m. And I do have information over here. So if anyone here is in environmental education, or I mean we all are, but if anyone here is a high school teacher specifically, or you know of other high school teachers, you can definitely get them onto our website. and then by doing so, we'll reach out to them and then get a chapter set up in different American locations. Because I think that's so powerful to have those localized impacts again, spread to different locations. Youth in America learning about things in Cape Town, in the Canadian Arctic, even in Alaska to kind of get those national connections as well. So our website is breakthedivide.net. You can head on out to the website. Just on the home page, there's a tab that says click here, and it's just a little information that you need to put in. And yeah, this is all my contact information. So if anyone does have any questions at any point, you can definitely contact me. But I think we have time for any questions right now. Yeah.
In your own high school, about how many students are involved in this project and how many have just said, heck, not for me?
Yeah, so I find that youth engagement is always a very tricky issue. I mean, there's different ways to tackle it. So in the Break the Divide Club itself, it's run at school for about 2 years. Initially, it kind of did start with the environmental club, and then as we kind of got support from different groups, kind of focused on more mental health, reconciliation, different projects, kind of bridged off into its own club as well. So I would say last year we had about 30 to 40 members in the club itself. This year we have about 30 to 40 members signed up again. But I think you saw one of the pictures. We also have different local chapters. So in that we have different youth from different schools collaborating on different events. So going back to the point of youth engagement though, like everyone isn't going to find this interesting. And that's okay. We need to understand that we have specific audiences that we can reach out to. And then for the other people, you know, that's the normal conversation about that. That's going to make that difference.
Where do you guys have chapters?
So right now, our chapters are we have a couple in Western Canada. So those are just in the local vicinity of Vancouver. There's also the couple in the Arctic. So there's one in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, which is northwestern. And we're getting some set up in Iqaluit, which is northeastern Canada. Also working on some in Greenland, but our most significant ones are also the ones in Cape Town, South Africa. We're getting one set up in northern India. So that's one where we're talking to students there about recent flooding that's actually occurred in their communities and how that's impacting them. And based on my connections, France, so across Europe and the UK, Belgium, yeah. So it's like those different connections that are constantly sprouting. And after going to the League of Environmental Educators in Florida conference, there's a couple starting up in Florida as well. And hopefully soon across the states.
I have a question. I think this is awesome. So how do you guys go about keeping those connections long term?
Yeah.
You know, once the quote unquote natural disaster in that moment has passed.
Yeah.
Is it broken up into like we talk about this at this moment, or what exactly is the process for keeping that going?
Yeah, so the biggest way that the connection really works is at first youth kind of talk to each other. They get their buddy. They talk about who they are as people. So they make those normal connections as a kind of buddy pen pal system. And then after that starts, we kind of get into a bit deeper topics. So talking about specific issues in the community themselves. So they don't need to be necessarily immediate impacts of climate change, like flooding or hurricanes or anything like that. Because even if a hurricane was 3 years ago or 10 years ago, I mean, there's still that impact that it's had on the ecosystem. So for environmental issues themselves, that's kind of how the connection goes. And then based on those conversations, we're currently working on actually creating an app that will let youth in these different locations connect with one another in this different environment. And we'll also be able to connect them with community stakeholders to work on projects like that. So that's kind of the main vision of where we're going at the moment, getting more chapters. And then really those sustained connections, we kind of have two approaches to our chapters themselves. They're either youth-led, so they're a youth-sponsored program where it's a club at the school that the youth are leading, and it's very important that they do have teachers supporting them. But there's also this other route that we're taking where teachers are starting up these programs and then getting youth involved. So I really think both ways work, and by having both avenues, we're tackling different audiences, but at the end of the day, it's we're engaging really with a lot of people. Yeah. Any other questions?
So you have these different groups, so then so like somebody, a new group is starting in
in Belgium.
Yeah.
Then would you connect them with other possible Break the Divide groups that they could then connect with, or how are you getting them connected to different groups?
Yeah, so once we have our app, we're hoping that will make a lot of the process automatic. But at the moment, what we do is we have to physically, it's kind of emailing, Skyping one another, kind of talking about what times work to meet, things like that. So if it was a chapter in Belgium, for example, we'd likely connect them with a location that's quite different than them, but also trying to look for things like language barriers. So maybe we would connect them with a school in Louisiana or Quebec, where kids could talk in French with each other, or in Canada where exactly. And a lot of the challenges that we face have been regarding time differences as well, because that's a major thing. Like talking to kids in Cape Town and Vancouver, there's a 9-hour difference, I think. So we would actually have to get to school at around 7 a.m. and it would be around 6 p.m. there, or 5 p.m. And it's, we're hoping that as the app develops, we can kind of do recorded video calls to kind of tackle that. But it's a lot of, youths, it's locality specific work. So when a connection happens, we kind of go from there.
Right, that's right. Yeah, awesome.
Any other questions?
So you mentioned you don't know where you're going to be in 40 years, but I want to know what your plans are for the next 5 years.
Next 5 years, my plans. So one thing that I've really gotten interested in is this idea of the intersections with climate change and human health. Because I think health is something that every single person relates to on a daily basis. And looking at things from a health perspective really allows us to kind of find our commonalities, kind of break the divide between people. And that's where I see myself going, a career in possibly public health, possibly, continuing to do things like this, especially with Break the Divide. I hoped for it to continue to become really international. And yeah, like public health wise, I really want to influence policy, influence people's mindsets, and get as many people onto this road as possible.
Ki hea nei au ki te mihi kia koe I te rangatira. O tira kia hoa, ko tai mai nei, no Canada, ko koutou nā rangatira mā popo mō tēnei wā. So just want to acknowledge your mahi and the work that you're doing, and also the work that you and your whole crew are doing. And in Māori and Indigenous New Zealand, kōrero is that the rangatahi, the youth, rangatira will be leaders tomorrow. Engari, ko koutou, he rangatira I nāianei. So you guys are leaders now. So just a big mihi, big acknowledgement to you, my great.
Thank you so much.
You heard it?
Okay, if anyone does have any other questions, please do. Thank you so much.